I have always wondered how hyperthreading and overclocking actually affect performance in games, so I decided to do some experimenting while also making a video about it. My goal for this video is to answer questions related to the viability of i3s for modern gaming, the difference between i5s and i7s for gaming, and the value of buying a higher-end processor. For my processor, I have an Intel i7-4790K that I can stably overclock to 4.8 GHz at 1.35 volts. For my motherboard, I have an Asus Z97 Sabertooth Mark I with USB 3.1. This board has a very nice and easy to use UEFI that also contains advanced settings, such as disabling hyperthreading in cores, which was necessary for this video. For my CPU cooler, I'm running a Corsair H90 140mm all-in-one unit with two Corsair SP140 fans running in push-pull on the intake to my case. For RAM, I have two sticks of 8GB each DDR3 Corsair Vengeance memory running at 1600 MHz with a cast latency of 10. My GPU is an EVGA GTX 980 for the win. They'll be run at default speeds for all tests, but will have a 125% of TDP power limit and be overvolted by plus 37 millivolts on the core. My main drive is a Samsung A50 EVO 500GB SSD. My system also has a 408GB Mushkin Chronos SSD for secondary storage, as well as a RAID 0 array Hitachi DeskStar 1TB 7200 RPM mechanical drives. For power supply, I have a Seasonic X Series 650W 80 plus gold unit. As far as synthetic benchmarks go, I will be running Cinebench R15, both multi-threaded as well as single-core, Unigine Valley run at 1080p ultra quality with 4 times anti-aliasing, Unigine Heaven at 1080p with ultra quality extreme tessellation as well as 8-time anti-aliasing, and finally 3D Mark Firestrike physics and combined tests run at default settings. The first game that I benchmarked was Counter-Strike Global Offensive run at 720p with all the eye candy turned down, and then at 1080p with everything turned up. I then moved on to the Metro Redux games. I tested both Last Light and 2033 at 1080p with maximum settings, first with physics enabled and then with it disabled. Note that in my NVIDIA driver control, I have my CPU set as the physics processor instead of my GPU. Moving on, I picked Dirt 3 run at 1080p with Ultra Preset. I picked this game as it is an AMD title, and so I wanted some variation in the testing. Finishing out my games test is Fallout 4, which is the newest title that I own, as well as one of my favorite games at the moment. I ran my tests at 1080p with the Ultra preset. For the different configurations being tested, I will start by simulating the Pentium G3258 processor by running my i7 with only 2 cores enabled and without hyperthreading, at the Pentium's stock speed of 3.2 GHz and then overclocked to 4.8 GHz. I will then simulate the i3 4370, Intel's top of the line Haswell i3, by disabling 2 cores but leaving hyperthreading enabled and running the core at 3.8 GHz. Even though the i3 4370 is a locked processor, I'll also be running this configuration overclocked 4.8 GHz to get a better idea of how Skylake i3s will run in comparison to the other processors in these tests. Next will be the simulation of the i5 4690K by disabling hyperthreading but leaving all 4 cores enabled, running at the i5's turbo speed of 3.9 GHz and then overclocked 4.8 GHz. Finally, I will run the full-fat Haswell i7 at stock settings and then overclocked to 4.8 GHz. Cinebench is all about raw power from the CPU and scales almost linearly with an increase in threads. Not really anything surprising here. On the single core side of things, the results are pretty much as you expect, with higher clocked processors scoring higher than their lower clocked counterparts. The Pentium does lag behind the others a bit, but that is likely due to Windows scheduling background processes on the same core that Cinebench was running on. The Unigine tests are meant to be purely graphical benchmarks, so it is interesting to see the lower clocked processors falling behind a bit. This would imply that Valley requires at least 2 fast cores to truly test the GPU exclusively. The Heaven benchmark, on the other hand, really doesn't seem to care at all about either core speed or threads available. In my opinion, this is great to see, as it shows that it can more reliably be used to benchmark just GPUs, even if the rest of the system is different. The Firestrike physics test is meant to purely benchmark how well CPU handles rigid body physics calculations. Like Cinebench, it scales almost linearly with threads available. The combined test is meant to show how well a system handles rigid body physics calculations, in this case a mountain falling down, while a graphically intensive scene is also playing out. It would seem that based on these numbers, this test really doesn't care about hyperthreading at all. Also note that as soon as I jumped to the simulated 4690K, my CPUs were being bottlenecked by my GTX 980. For my Counter-Strike test, I used a benchmarking map that can be found on the Steam Workshop. One of the main reasons that I picked CSGO is that it is well known to be a very CPU-intensive game, and I think my tests show this. An interesting point about this is it doesn't seem like the game really utilizes more than 4 threads, as my i5 tests and i7 tests were within margin of error of each other. Overclocking, however, made a huge impact on frame rates, as the Pentium boosted from 82 FPS when run at 3.2 GHz at 720p, all the way up to 215 FPS when overclocked to 4.8 GHz. Another interesting discovery is that even at 1080p, with all the details turned up, an i3 will still bottleneck a GTX 980 in this game. For the Metro games, I used the included benchmarking runs. Enabling and disabling physics didn't change the relative performance of the CPUs as much as I thought it would, although it did make a big difference for the lower-end Pentium and i3. As with the Metro games, I used an included benchmark for Gen 3. I was surprised to see how well this title scaled with more threads, even if they were hyperthreads. It seems ironic that an AMD game would be so optimized for hyperthreading when AMD doesn't yet have a simultaneous multi-threaded core in their CPU lineup. For those watching this in the future, do know that this was released pre-Zen. Fallout 4 is the only game I tested where I didn't have a perfectly consistent benchmark to use, so I made my own and used Fraps to record the average frame rates. I started with a save that is fairly late in the game, so my settlements have quite a few people in them, as well as some large structures. The run that I did takes place during the day and starts at a house in Sanctuary Hills, crosses the river to the Red Rocket truck stop, and then continues down the road to Concord and finishes on the doorstep of the Museum of Freedom. Being the newest tile in my testing, I expected it to scale the best with both core count as well as clock speed, and I wasn't disappointed. For the lower end configurations, there was a huge difference in performance between the stock settings and the overclocked ones. What these graphs don't show, however, is how much stuttering there was while playing the benchmark with the Pentium. It was pretty much unplayable. To get my results into a format that could actually be compared, I took the score in a given test from a given processor and assigned it a percentage of the best results for that test. I then took the average of all these results to arrive at a final number on a scale between 0 and 100 that could be compared. It is this graph in particular that really shows the value of overclocking, as in each case, overclocking a given configuration allowed it to catch up to or pass the next highest configuration on the list. One thing that bugs me about both GPU and CPU comparison videos is that lists of FPS per dollar or performance per dollar always take into account the price of the item being tested, not the cost of the entire system, which is a more correct way of doing it. For this graph, I took the performance index from the previous graph and divided it by the cost of the processor based on the lowest price from PC Part Picker, plus the cost of the rest of my tower based on market prices, which turned out to be around $1,700 US. This graph shows that if you're getting a high-end gaming build, it really does make sense to go with an i7 over an i5, although for lower-end configurations, I can't say. Maybe that'll be a topic for a future video. Getting the best value processor is a topic oft discussed on YouTube comment sections as well as various forums. The general consensus seems to be that i7s are better than i5s for gaming, but not enough to make a big enough difference to account for the increase in cost. I would argue that if you're getting a high-end system with an enthusiast class graphics card, then it makes sense to upgrade to an i7 over an i5. The other conclusion to this video revolves around the lower end price segment. There was much enthusiasm when Intel released the overclockable G3258 20th anniversary Pentium chip with the Devil's Canyon Haswell refresh. This processor quickly appeared in budget build guides all over the place. If you're one of the people that's shopping for a low-end gaming rig in the $450 or below range, I would recommend looking at benchmarks of GPUs that you're looking at and compare those numbers to the numbers in my testing in order to see where potential bottlenecks will be. My personal recommendation for low budget builds is to look at a Skylake i3 or shop Craigslist in your area to find something like a Sandy Bridge or Ivy Bridge i5 or i7. These CPUs will give you all around better performance for the price. I would like to thank anyone who's gotten this far in the video for watching. This is my first real video and will likely not be very good. I would love to see some constructive criticism in the comments section, as well as to hear what setups all of you are running, and any future video topics you would like to see. Thank you again for watching.